Welcome back to my channel in part 3 in response to Genetically Modified Skeptic's recent video called Atheists Can't Answer This Question, ... but we can. In this video, Drew, also known as Genetically Modified Skeptic, seemed to argue that Frank Turek and apologists in general are dishonest. In parts 1 and 2, we talked about his arguments and his lame objections, but now we're in part 3 and the final part of this short series. Now, without a doubt, this is my favorite video in the series, so make sure you stick around to the end, because I'm convinced that this video will only get better and better. Now, without further ado, let's just get right into it. So, meme team, are you ready? Then let's go!
Turek doesn't understand how DNA formed. It looks complicated and impressive to him, so he settles with the answer of God just made it, rather than studying the readily accessible scientific resources on the subject or simply being honest and humble in saying, I don't know.
Ah, the good old I don't know appeal. I see this move a lot with popular YouTube atheists, and you know what? Some days I think that YouTube atheism is just one giant meme collector passing on slogans to each other, because most of these slogans that you hear, you'll find on all of the major channels and then repeated in the comment sections. But the worst part about it is none of these slogans actually make good points. Or maybe that's just me. But anyways, when atheists use the I don't know appeal, it's usually in the context of claiming that Christians pretend like they have answers to things that they don't, and unlike Christians, atheists are humble and honest enough to say, I don't know. Gee, who wouldn't want to be an atheist? I mean, after all, the options are either be honest and humble and be an atheist, or be an arrogant, deluded liar and go over there with the Christians. Okay, that may have been a tad hyperbolic, but as we'll come to see here a bit later on, Drew seems to hold a similar view to those kinds of atheists. Later on in this video, he claims that the difference between a Christian and an atheist is that the atheists will admit that they don't know, and Christians will just say God did it. He then goes on to say that all he's asking is that rather than admitting that they just don't know, they shouldn't be making up improvable explanations so that way they don't have to admit that they don't know. Yeah, because that's what all of us Christians are really doing. On Drew's part, this is a perfect example of that humility that he was just talking about, wouldn't you say? Now, one gigantic problem with this claim is that it's not more humble and honest to say, I don't know, if you have reasons for thinking that you do know. Just because some atheists like Drew may not like those reasons, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't say that you don't know. In fact, it would actually be dishonest to say that you don't know when you believe that you do know. At any rate, in the case of Turek, he did give reasons for why he thought his conclusion was the right one. So if he were to say that he didn't know, that would actually have been dishonest and would have been the morally wrong thing for Turek to do. Now we can ask the question, can you still believe that you know something even if there's a chance that you could be wrong? Well, yes, there's always a chance that we could be wrong, but that's the case with virtually everything that we believe. But to make matters worse here for Drew, if you watch the video again, Turek never even claimed that he did know. He only gave reasons for why he thinks that God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe and the messages found in DNA, while explaining why he thinks that natural processes aren't sufficient. At no point did he say that he did know or that he was certain about anything. So, yeah. Now, let's just keep moving.
In fact, this entire argument comes down to, I can't explain that naturalistically, so that proves God did it. There's something that hasn't been explained, so God is invoked to fill that gap in our understanding. That's what's called arguing for a God of the gaps. It's a well-recognized fallacy, and one which Turek knows about.
Alright, just stop right there. So Drew accused Turek of committing the fallacy of the God of the gaps and said that Turek's argument comes down to saying, I can't prove this naturalistically, so that proves that God did it. But is that the reasoning that Turek used? Did Turek argue that because there's something that we can't explain naturally, that proves that God did it? First, let's be clear on what a God of the gaps argument is, since a lot of people who use the objection misunderstand it. When used fallaciously, God of the gaps is really just an appeal to ignorance, which is a logical fallacy. It's basically arguing to a conclusion when the only reason that you have for coming to the conclusion is because the other position can't explain it. In order for someone to be guilty of the God of the gaps fallacy, the person would have to be arguing that because we don't have an explanation for something, that alone is proof that God did it. And the key word there is alone. Or someone can argue that we know that God exists for no other reason than the fact that God hasn't been proven not to exist. Or in the way that Drew accuses Turek of using it, someone would be guilty of the fallacy if they argued that because you can't prove something by nature, that in itself is enough proof to prove that God did it. Just to make sure we're clear, in a God of the gaps argument, the reason given for the premise is entirely based on what we don't know and not based on anything that we do know. It goes from because we don't know how something happened and because you don't know, therefore we do know that God did it. So in other words, for Turek to be guilty of this fallacy, the reasons that he gave for his conclusion would have to have been argued entirely based off of what we don't know and not from anything that we do know. Now that we're all clear, let's go ahead and hear Turek's argument again.
Well, I don't think that works for a number of reasons. One reason, obviously, is the universe had a beginning, and secondly, a fine-tuned beginning. Okay, so there appears to be intelligence behind the universe. Secondly, the genome that we mentioned earlier, the 3.2 billion letter genome, is like a software program. If you're walking along the beach and you see in the sand, "John loves Mary," you don't go, "Gee, the waves made that." Or the crabs came out of the water and made that message in the sand, right? You know immediately that that message must be the product of a mind. In all our prior experience, messages always come from minds. Now that's just a few letters long or a couple of words long. But imagine a message 3.2 billion letters long in every one of our cells. If John loves Mary requires a message, a messenger, a mind, then a software program 3.2 billion letters long also seems to require a mind, a great mind, to create. There's only 4 known natural forces: gravity, the strong and weak nuclear forces, and electromagnetism, light. Which one of those 4, or combination thereof, can create a software program? The answer is none of them.
All right, so 2 things to point out. First, as we just heard, Turek argued to his conclusion based off of things that we do know. He appealed to what we do know about physics and the constants of the universe, and then he argued from what we know about information and messages. Notice that this is not arguing from a gap or a lack of reasons, but instead he's given reasons for why God sufficiently explains the messages in DNA. Namely, because in all of our experiences, messages always come from minds. The second thing he does is argue why naturalistic reasons aren't sufficient. Namely, because again, in all of our experiences, messages, in the sense that he's using the word, never come from naturalistic processes apart from minds. So his argument's based on inference from what we do know, not from what we don't. So Turek's not guilty of using the fallacy. Now keep in mind that you don't have to agree with Turek on his conclusion or even the reasons that he gave for it in order to agree that Drew is wrong on this point. Remember, the God of the gaps fallacy is a logical error, not a factual error. So if you think that Turek is factually wrong, that just isn't relevant when it comes to the fallacy. And I hope that part is clear. So to put it all in perspective, counter to what Drew charged him with, Turek is not saying that there's something that we don't know in science, so let's fill it with God. Instead, he's given independent reasons for why messages are consistent with what we know about a mind and aren't consistent with what we know about nature. From there, he argues that God is a more superior explanation than naturalism. Now, one more quick point about this. When Turek appeals to messages as evidence, the evidence for messages is not being used directly as evidence for God. So here's another way that we can be sure that Drew is wrong in claiming that Turek's using a God of the gaps argument. Instead, the evidence is being used for the premise that messages come from minds, not the conclusion that God is the best explanation for information found in DNA. So Turek added more premises to his argument, which led to the conclusion of God being the best explanation, but this is important to note because it makes it even more clear. So for Drew to say that Turek is reasoning by God of the gaps is doubly erred. Let's keep going.
That's what's called arguing for a God of the gaps. It's a well-recognized fallacy and one which Turek knows about. How do I know he knows it? You'll see how in the ironic twist that is the ending of Turek's answer.
The answer is none of them. And if they're going to say, well, one day we'll figure that out, I call that faith.
Here's the first part of the irony. He accuses atheists of having faith, implying that's a bad thing. Meanwhile, he bases his whole life and career on the idea that faith is a reliable way to obtain truth and should be encouraged. Why is it bad for atheists to have faith, but it's totally okay for Christians to? That's blatant and laughable hypocrisy.
All right, one thing at a time. First, let's talk about what Turek said that saying, we'll figure it out one day, is an appeal to naturalism of the gaps, which is, again, another way of saying that they would be guilty of fallaciously appealing to ignorance. Just to recap, appealing to ignorance is when you argue from ignorance as your sole evidence for your conclusion. Now, I can't speak for Turek, but here's what I think he was getting at. Essentially, when people are saying God of the gaps, they're usually implying that the gap will not be filled by God and it will be filled by science one day. But because we sadly don't have access to what science will or will not discover in the future, the position is being argued from ignorance rather than other reasons. What science will or will not discover one day is information that's impossible for an atheist to have. And notice that you can't appeal to discoveries in the past to support your argument unless you can show a direct link between the things in the past and the thing that we're talking about in the future. So you can't appeal to things like discovering how lightning works as evidence that science will discover a naturalistic origin for the information found in DNA. And one more quick point about the God of the Gaps accusation. When theists make arguments, they're usually saying that God is a good explanation for the facts that we observe and is superior to naturalism. When atheists cry God of the Gaps, this is an indirect way of admitting that their worldview isn't sufficient enough to explain the data. If their worldview was adequate enough to explain it, then they would give those reasons rather than crying God of the Gaps. The only way to say that naturalistic sciences can explain the data better than the Christian worldview is by arguing from ignorance and the lack of data. As we just talked about, is not something that's possible for any atheist to know. Now let's hear that again, and then we'll get back to Drew's comments.
Here's the first part of the irony. He accuses atheists of having faith, implying that's a bad thing. Meanwhile, he bases his whole life and career on the idea that faith is a reliable way to obtain truth and should be encouraged. Why is it bad for atheists to have faith, but it's totally okay for Christians to? That's blatant and laughable hypocrisy.
Drew says that Turek is saying that faith is a bad thing while basing his entire life and career on faith, and then he goes on to say how hypocritical this is of Turek. First off, as Drew pointed out in the video that he made right after the one that we're reviewing, faith is not a word that's always referring to the same thing. Here's a quick snippet.
Here's what's going wrong there. The atheist in that scenario is holding to a rigid definition of faith, assuming and asserting that it can have only one meaning. The reality is, faith means very different things to different people.
Now, Drew's right about this point. We have several different uses of the word faith today. People can say, I have faith in my friends, which is another way of saying that they believe that they can rely on their friends. Or they can say, my faith is dear to me, in which they're using the word to mean that their religious beliefs are dear to them. And there are plenty more examples like this. But the point is, the word is not static. It has multiple usages, so context means everything. Context is king, yo. And I'm pretty glad to see Drew agrees with me on this point. But this makes his argument against Turek even more confusing. Knowing that the word faith has multiple usages, he accuses Turek of basing his entire life and career on the belief that faith is a reliable way to come to know truth. What? That sure is news to me, and I'm sure it's news to Turek too. I'm not aware of anywhere in Turek's career where he argues that faith is a reliable way to know truth and that he bases his entire life and career off of thinking that it is. In fact, I can't think of a single Christian apologist who defines faith the way that Drew is accusing Turek of doing. It's true that faith should be encouraged, but that's because it's placing your saving trust in Christ based off of what we do know, not what we don't. Contrary to what Drew accuses Christians of, faith, which is pistis in Greek, is better translated as trust or confidence. I recently did a video on this in response to R and Raw, in which I go through this in detail, and it's linked in the description if you're interested. But to be sure of Turek's position, prior to recording this video, I actually reached out to him just to be extra sure that he didn't hold the view of faith that Drew claims that he does. And he texted me back and said, yes, faith is not an epistemology. Faith is trusting in what you have good evidence to believe. You get that evidence by evaluating the data you get from your senses with the laws of logic and other self-evident principles. Now, just so that way we can be sure that this isn't contrary to his public position, I just searched Frank Turek faith on YouTube, and here's a couple of clips from the first two videos that came up. Now, let's hear how Frank himself describes faith in these videos.
Your faith doesn't change a thing about whether or not this book is true. The only thing your faith does is it appropriates the salvific content of it to you.
Belief that is intellectual. Belief in is after you know that it's true, trust in it. In fact, the better word, as you know, Bobby, in the Greek is trust. After you know that Jesus is the Savior, then trust in Him for your salvation. So the Bible's faith is not blind faith. It's telling you to get belief that, but it's saying after you have belief that, go to your heart and trust in.
Yeah. And in case you think that Frank has a radical view, here's a couple more quick clips from other apologists on what faith is.
Faith is trusting in what you have good reason to think is true. That's what I would define faith as. Faith is trusting in that which you have good reason to think is true.
That's what biblical faith or belief is. It isn't just an intellectual acknowledgement. It's an awareness of the truth of something and a willingness to act because you've been so convinced of the truthfulness of this.
And that is a step of trust, a step, you could say, of faith, but it's not blind. It's grounded in good reasons to believe this is true.
The Greek word for faith is pistis. It is more or less very similar to the idea of being loyal or having trust in something or someone. It is not denoted to mean that which is used as the means to form trust in something or someone.
So I have no idea where Drew is getting this from. And since he claimed that Turek believes that faith is a reliable way of coming to know truth, then I would love to see where he got that from. Without that information, I think we could be reasonably certain that once again, Drew is wrong. Okay, let's keep going.
To be clear, I don't think that faith is a reliable path to truth, and I strongly discourage its belief or invocation. Still, this guy, once again, is too dense to understand this hypocrisy or is too dishonest to recognize it, and I don't think he's too dense. This is so manipulative of his impressionable audience. It's gross.
There isn't an eye roll grand enough that would do justice to how I feel about that statement. Give me a break.
Here's where the real irony comes in. Turek bases his whole argument on naturalism hasn't explained it, so God must have done it.
Wrong.
While poking fun at the natural law of the gaps fallacy. Here's the thing, Turek. 1, DNA can and has been explained naturalistically. You just don't know that because you're scientifically illiterate.
Wrong. And wrong on virtually every point, but we've already covered them in this series. So let's just keep going.
2, the difference between you, a Christian, and myself, an atheist, is that when we see something that we can't explain, you say, God did it, and I say, I don't know.
Wrong. Again, we've already covered why this is wrong.
I don't ask that anyone assert that naturalism can explain everything. All I ask is that when you don't know something, don't make up an unproven explanation so that you don't have to admit that you don't know. Just admit ignorance and then research it from there. That's the basis of intellectual honesty, and I hope the viewers of this video hold to that themselves. I have really little hope for Turek, though, because as we've seen here, honesty is not his strong suit.
Okay, so here we have a little irony. As we demonstrated in the first 2 videos of the series, I just think that Drew just doesn't understand the arguments that Turek made, and because of that, Drew was wrong most of the time in his response to Turek. But Drew still gave reasons for his position. Now, what would happen if I took that fact and then claimed that Drew was being intentionally dishonest simply because he didn't know what I know about the arguments, and apparently he didn't do research before responding? I ask this because even if Turek were just as wrong about his answers as Drew was about his objections, that is precisely what he did to Turek. Hey, Pot. Hey, meet Kettle. Now here I want to show something again that we showed in the first video. Now let's take one more look at Drew's comment that he pinned on this video. Do you think Turek is being dishonest? Does he understand the arguments against intelligent design? I voiced my opinion, but I'm still a bit conflicted. Really? If he were truly conflicted, then why not be sure before you go out your way to convince literally hundreds of thousands of people that Frank Turek is a liar?
Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic.
Yeah. Well, we all make mistakes, but hopefully now he won't repeat this mistake ever again. Well, that does it for the short series in response to Drew's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you hit subscribe so that way you don't miss what I got coming next. And you should be excited for what I got coming next because it's going to be fresh. And I'll assume that you like your videos like you like your laundry. But before I go, I need a little help. So I reached out to someone because I just needed to know. The next time that Drew from Genetically Modified Skeptic says,
This is so manipulative of his impressionable audience. It's gross.
What should I say?
Hey, Drew, what do you mean?